Well, I had done two underground films. Well, really three or four, but two long underground films, feature-length ones, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, which I had shot myself and edited myself. They were in 35 millimeter. They had been at some film festivals, the Edinburgh Film Festival, the Adelaide and Auckland Film Festivals, and so on. And I had to decide whether I was going to really make filmmaking my life, my business, the way I earn my living, or not. And I couldn't do it as an underground filmmaker because you didn't make any money as an underground filmmaker. Uh, and looking around at the landscape of Canadian filmmaking, there really was only one serious commercial enterprise, and that was Cinepix in Montreal, because otherwise you were making films about fishermen and farmers for the National Film Board, or you were doing small things for the CBC. Although the CBC was doing some interesting things, but that was television, of course, and it wasn't movie making. So I decided at a certain point, yes, I wanted to be a professional filmmaker. That would be my life. I gave up the idea of being a novelist, and I thought I'm going to be a filmmaker. That meant if I was going to stay in Canada, going to Montreal and engaging with Cinepix, because Cinepix had been a distributor of films and then decided to go into filmmaking, film production, and they had made some very lovely, gentle, softcore porn films that were like Valerie, which were also very political in the Quebec manner, and they were not just porn films. They were very funny and very witty, and had a bite to them, a political bite to them. And I thought these are interesting guys, and so maybe there's something we could do there. Well, I went there. I met John Dunning and Andre Link, the two Cinepix guys, the Cinepixies, and I found them to be really very congenial and very intelligent and very open and very interested. And I showed them Stereo and Crimes of the Future and said, maybe I could direct one of your porn films. And they said, well, we can see from your films that you have a very exquisite sexual sensibility. We're just not sure what kind it is. And because the sexuality in both of those films was kind of very interesting and mixed and omnisexual and whatever. But they gave me a chance to direct a couple of auditions for them, and finally I showed them my script for Shivers, and I said, this is what I want to do. I'm a horror filmmaker. Obviously, it just seems natural to me. I didn't plan to be, but when I started to write, that's what came up out of the typewriter. And are you interested? And they were very interested because their sex films sold well in Europe, but they couldn't get them to play at all in America. And they knew that Roger Corman type low budget horror films had a market in America. And they thought, well, this could be a homegrown kind of version of that. And they were very excited about it. And I was very excited that they were. Of course, they didn't exactly necessarily want me as the director because they weren't sure about my underground films, how that style would translate into a commercial, mainstream kind of film. And I think that at a certain point they tried to buy the script from me so that someone else could direct it. And I said, no, if you want the script, you got to take me. And finally they said, okay. And but it was not easy to get the film financed because it was a horror film, and there was no tradition in Canadian filmmaking of horror films or genre films of any kind. In fact, once again, the tradition was a kind of docudramas that the National Film Board would make from time to time, and so it was quite a struggle to get Telefilm, which then was called the Canadian Film Development Corporation, to invest in Shivers. But finally they did. I mean, I actually went to LA because I despaired of it ever happening. It was obvious that Cinepix really needed financing from the Canadian government in order to make it work. And I went to LA. It was the first time I had ever been there. Went with Norman Snyder, who was a writer who actually ended up co-writing Dead Ringers with me much later. And we rented a red Mustang convertible, and we drove around, and it was wonderful because it was February and horrible in Toronto, and it was palm trees and sunshine in LA, and it was great. And I took my project around to a lot of places like Roger Corman's filmmaking production house. And they all said, no, we would make this. We love this. This is a great idea. We'll do that. So I came back to Toronto thinking I'm going to have to move to LA, as many others had done. As actually Lorne Michaels, who I knew from Toronto, was in LA, not in New York at that time, doing some comedy specials. By the time I got back to Toronto, though, Cinepix had convinced the Telefilm to invest in Shivers. And so that was a crucial moment because I would have moved to LA. I would have had to move to LA if it had not been for that moment of perseverance, I guess, on the part of Cinepix. And so that's how I began my career with Cinepix. Well, I had friends who were interested in going to film school, and there were no film schools in Toronto. There was Ryerson, but that was really more for technicians than, let's say, directors. If you wanted to be a TV cameraman, for example, you would go to Ryerson. But the London School of Film Technique and a couple of film schools in Los Angeles were really the only film schools around. I couldn't afford to go there, to go to those places, live there, and go to school. So I felt ultimately that I would have to learn on the job, and that was, as I have said before, the John Dunning and Andre Link School of Filmmaking. They were my film school. And John was my movie father, and I think Andre was a little bit like my movie uncle. John was more involved in the creative side, Andre more on the financing and distribution side. And it was a fabulous time, it really was, because John was incredibly open, very sweet, very gentle, very wise, and very knowing about filmmaking. All the things that as an underground filmmaker you wouldn't have to deal with, that is to say professional actors, professional technicians, because you would do it all yourself and you'd shoot with your friends, you know, and professional editors and so on, and all of that. I mean, I remember my first production meeting, sitting around a table with all of these people who John had placed around me because they were all more experienced than I was, and that was his technique, was, okay, I've got a first-time film director, basically. I will surround him with people who are not first-time crew and heads of department, and they will help him make the movie, and they'll show him how to make the movie. And that's exactly what happened. But I remember sitting there, and there were all these people, production manager and production designer and art director, and I had no idea what they did. I actually didn't know what their function was. Gradually, of course. And I only had 2 weeks to learn because it was 2 weeks was our shooting schedule for Shivers. Right. $185,000 budget. And then it ended up making $5 million, and was the first film that had ever actually returned the investment of the Canadian Film Development Corporation. But John was incredibly open, and I saw how Cinepix worked. I had the run of the office. He actually let me, when I was trying to write RABID, the next movie that I did, and the next movie I did for Cinepix, he let me stay in his country place with my girlfriend, who then became my wife, and was just a really congenial, very sweet, very giving, very generous guy, and it really you couldn't have a better film school. It was fantastic. I learned so much from those guys. Yeah, my original title for Shivers was Orgy of the Blood Parasites, because I was ready to really go for it, not hold back. You know, we're making a horror film, let's go for it. At a certain point, they wanted to pull it back to the parasite murders, a little less confrontational maybe. And then ultimately it was called Shivers in Canada, and then in the US they called it They Came From Within. An interesting thing is I went to a German film festival years later, in Hof in Germany. It was a genre film festival. And we showed it. We showed Shivers. And a man stood up, a German, and he said, "How can you show this? This is so obviously stolen from Alien." because in this movie you have a parasite that burns its way out of the stomach and jumps on the face and then burns and then goes inside. It's just like Alien. And I said, yes, except that Shivers was made 2 years before Alien. He said, ah, now we know who the thief is. And it's true that one of the writers of Alien did know my films very well. So did he steal that? I don't know, but it's awfully similar, I have to say. No one had made a horror film with that parasite aspect to it until I had done it with Shivers.
That was Dan O'Bannon.
Dan O'Bannon had confessed to John Landis that he particularly liked the Canadian films. He said, meaning mine. Anyway, who knows? I think, Valerie was interesting because, as I say, it was really rather subversive and radical because of its sort of anti-clerical, anti-church aspect, and of course the censorship aspect, because it was very sexual and very overt and very playful, and none of these things had been acceptable in Canada, and particularly in Quebec, which at that point was still very dominated by the Catholic Church. I think perhaps John was and Andre were more relaxed in a weird way about Shivers, because there were more precedents for it. They had their eye not on Canada necessarily, but on the U.S. And they knew, as I say, from the Corman example and many others, that a film like that could play well in the U.S. So even if we got censored, somehow blocked from releasing the film in Canada, there were many other outlets for it. So I didn't think they were very nervous about it, except certainly John was very passionate about the films that he made, and he was very passionate about Shivers, even though it was a small film and so on and so on. But that was another thing that was great, is that you weren't considered like some sort of poor relative because you're making a low budget horror film there. That was big stuff for them, and you felt like you were doing a major thing, which of course for me in my career it actually was. And so you got you felt very validated and very supported and and there was excitement about it. I'd say excitement more than nervousness. There was always a bit of nervousness. 2 weeks to do a movie which has a lot of special effects and a lot of action that's a challenge. It would be a challenge for me to do that movie now with that kind of schedule. Yes, I mean, famously, Robert Fulford, writing as Marshall Delaney for Saturday Night Magazine, had really crucified Shivers. He on the cover of Saturday Night Magazine had said, "You should know how bad this movie is. You paid for it," meaning the taxpayers and television. Of course, by the time that article came out, we'd already repaid the taxpayers and given them a profit. He didn't seem to mention that, but it scared what was to become telefilm, and they were afraid to invest in my next movie, which was RABID. Which was also a horror film. I don't think at that point we had cast Marilyn Chambers, the porno queen, but that would have made them even more nervous. So it actually cost me a couple of years of my filmmaking life, that article by Fulford. He likes to say that it gave me a sort of edgy cachet and is taking all kinds of credit for that. But basically, he screwed me up for a couple of years, actually, because Telefilm was afraid to invest in my film. And until Cinepix figured out a way to kind of put 3 movies together as a package and kind of bury RABID in that, they couldn't really finance the film, even though we were all ready to go with it. So that was, that's the interface you have with the journalists, with the press, you do not make films in a vacuum. You don't release them in a vacuum, but you also don't make them and finance them in a vacuum. You have to deal with that. I must say, making Shivers and RABID the way that they were made gave me incredible strength and endurance and understanding about filmmaking in general and how tough it is. And certainly to that extent, Fulford was right. But I didn't really need his extra little sort of stab of the shiv, to help me along there. Well, John and Andre are very Canadian. You know, they're very different from Roger. And I did meet Roger a couple of times, and he is delightful. He's incredibly well educated and cultured, and intelligent guy. Has a very, you know, he too has great passion for what he's done, and has a sort of an amused sort of perspective on it at the same time. He can sort of hold both those things in his temperament. And I don't think that John and Andre were really trying to emulate Corman. It wasn't exactly a model, because the way things worked in Canada could not be the same as the way things worked in the U.S. In the U.S., you don't get government funding for movies. You just don't. So the whole structure of financing immediately was different in Canada, plus the European aspect of Canadian financing, the potential for advanced sales in Europe and so on. We were much closer to that in Canada than anybody in California. So the tone was different, I must say. And in a way, it was better for me to grow up as a filmmaker in Canada, because the pressure is off, the sort of unnatural pressures. I mean, every time I would go to LA, I'd start reading the trades, that is to say, Hollywood Reporter, Variety, and I'd start to say, well, wait a minute, how did he get that deal? And God, I don't have an agent, and gee, I should get a lawyer. You know, all of that stuff is so present and so overheated in Hollywood, because it's really a one industry town, basically. You know, movies and TV. I mean, that's it. And certainly was even more like that then. You know, now that things have diversified with the internet and so on. But so there was as I say, a slightly less overheated kind of atmosphere that you were working in Montreal. I never went to Hollywood. I've not ever shot a foot of film in America. So I've never been a Hollywood filmmaker the way my friend Ivan, who was also a producer on Shivers and RABID, was. I mean, his aspiration always was to go to Hollywood and be a mainstream Hollywood type filmmaker. That was never my aspiration, and I never did it. The furthest I went from Montreal was to Toronto, you know, and interestingly enough, even Scanners, you know, we shot some of it. We shot a fair amount of it in Montreal. I'll tell you what I did miss when I came to Toronto, though, was the whole coterie of French Canadian filmmakers. I mean, I remember, you know, Jean-Pierre Lefebvre and Gilles Carle. I knew them all, and they were, even though they had a kind of bemused attitude towards Dunning and Link, because they thought they were kind of, you know, they said, you know, they really enjoy porn. I said, yeah, well, you know, there's nothing too wrong with that. And they, Denis Leroux and Claude Leroux, you know, they were sometimes working for Cinepix, making films for them, and then the more politically oriented, artsy filmmakers would stay away from Cinepix, but they couldn't deny that they were an interesting force that they had to deal with. And I enjoyed those meetings and interacting with the Quebecois filmmakers. I mean, it was really interesting, and there wasn't that in Toronto. You know, there were very few Toronto filmmakers around, and most of them didn't last long. Either they disappeared, or they went to LA. You know, so I didn't have that. I didn't have other directors to talk to when I was in Toronto. Not too many, anyway. I watched all of the Cinepix softcore movies, and I really liked them all, and I liked their actors, and I liked the Quebecoisness of it. They were unique. They were not French. They were not anything but Quebecois, even making those films. And later I got to work with one of the actresses from Deux Femmes en Or in Naked Lunch, and it was really, I actually was really excited about that. So it was great. No, I think that there's a whole new aspect to filmmaking and low budget filmmaking. You see movies like Paranormal and the Blair Witch Project. I think those are equivalent. Whether and though I haven't seen any of the Saw or Hostel movies, the sort of so-called torture porn horror films, but I think that they come out of the same zeitgeist. Certainly horror films are eternal. They've always, since the beginning of cinema, they've always been made. They were a literary category as well, and literature and poetic category and poems, and it's something to. There's something about the human psyche that needs to deal with death in a particular way, and I don't think that will ever go away. So it will express itself one way or another, and I think the means to making subversive, low budget films that work outside the mainstream, I think that will always be there. I think it's always been there.